Hello, it's Friday, July 15th, and this is the College Football Daily. I'm Brandon Marcello. Conference realignment is still a hot topic, and despite the college football world quieting down in the wake of USC and UCLA leaving the Pac 12 for the Big Ten 2 weeks ago, everyone is still on alert for the next domino to fall. The biggest domino left on the board is Notre Dame. The Irish are the ultimate prize on the board. But as the independent team and a big time national brand, we begin to wonder, is there actually any value in joining a conference? And would such a move, if it were to happen, be imminent? To get a much better idea of what the future holds, let's talk to Notre Dame insider Tim Prister of Irish Illustrated. Tim, thanks for joining us. So, in a very elementary understanding of all this, Notre Dame is a big piece on the board, but why is it that Notre Dame is that big piece, and would it actually make sense for Notre Dame to join a conference?
Yeah, Brennan, I don't know if they're the domino that's about to fall, but certainly they're on tap. I think in the short term, Notre Dame remains an independent, but long term, I think it's going to be very difficult. And part of that is that Notre Dame is leaving money on the table on a yearly basis as an independent. I think most people think that Notre Dame, as an independent with their NBC contract, that they make more than they would if they were in a conference. That's not true. And then the other thing is that, Notre Dame's tie-in with the ACC, the Big Ten, and the SEC pay out more to their constituency, and that would probably grow as the size of those conferences grow. So, especially I always throw this in, especially post-pandemic, Notre Dame, and I don't think any school is in a position to leave money on the table. And as we look at it right now, there's probably 20, 25, 30 million on the table that Notre Dame is not collecting as an independent slash as a part of the ACC. The ACC just does not pay out as much as the Big Ten and the SEC. So it makes sense long term. Notre Dame has fought it. I grew up in South Bend. I think everybody here always thought that Notre Dame could remain an independent, but we couldn't imagine, the twists and turns of the college game. When Texas and Oklahoma announced, or when the SEC announced that they would be joining them in a couple of years, that was one thing. When USC and UCLA with the Big Ten eliminated and rubbed away all the borders, that changed a lot of things. So we're headed to major, sized conferences. How soon all that happens, I can't answer that. But I think Notre Dame ultimately is going to have to be there. They'll be in a position where it just makes more sense to be a part of a conference.
Yeah, you're talking about the finances, and I was trying to figure this all out. Notre Dame, that NBC contract gets, I guess, about maybe $15 million a year from that. And then the ACC pays them a little bit for the other sports because, as some people might not know, most of Notre Dame's other sports are in the ACC other than football and, of course, in hockey. So they're leaving a lot of money on the table, at least what we can see from tax documents and everything. And we're getting to a point now where the Big Ten and the SEC, at least according to projections from Navigate, it was a great research firm, they're going to be paying out maybe more than $100 million to teams. And based off the sources I've been talking to in the business with this expansion going on, we might be actually approaching closer to $150 million here before the end of this decade, which is substantial. So I lead it into this with that financial picture in place. Notre Dame's NBC contract, I think, ends after 2025. So if Notre Dame were like, hey, let's try to remain independent here for another 5-10 years or whatever, what kind of value would their own media rights have in the open market if they were to remain an independent?
Well, that's a good question. If you put it up for bid, I think a couple other people will put bids in there. I think one way or another, the whole thing about with Notre Dame was we're going to remain independent as long as we have a TV partner, as long as Notre Dame has a shot at being part of the whole national title picture, which they've had. And then the third factor was whether it was viable financially. And so that's where they're lagging. I would imagine if you put it up for bid, NBC might be outbid. Who knows? I don't know. That's a good situation for Notre Dame and whoever Notre Dame ends up being tied with, probably the Big Ten, but whoever ends up being tied with, because Now you get another player in the TV package. So that's probably more than, I mean, fully conceptualizing what direction that goes and how much they get and who bids what. That's beyond my comprehension right now. But there's a lot of steps, and as I've been saying through this whole process, there's so many layers to go in the whole process, not only for Notre Dame but just college football in general. Who's going to make up the SEC? Florida State, Miami, Clemson. I'm sure that those are desirable commodities for the SEC. I've had a lot of people say, well, why can't Notre Dame propose such and such to the ACC and pull this team away? Because Clemson, Florida State, Miami, to name three, are probably inclined to go to the SEC, and then that shoots apart the ACC.
So from your standpoint, what conference, if Notre Dame were to try and maybe join here in the coming years, makes the most sense? Is it the ACC, the Big Ten, or maybe a quote unquote wild card like the SEC?
Yeah, I think in a perfect world, from Notre Dame's perspective, or at least from the perspective of Jack Swarbrick, their vice president and director of athletics, they would say the ACC. That's why they joined it. They wanted the East Coast, the ACC markets. They felt very comfortable with that. They liked recruiting in those areas, and they've done a good job. Now they've dipped into Georgia, which is, I guess, Georgia Tech, but that's also SEC country with Georgia, and they've recruited real strongly. Kyle Hamilton, to name one, out of Georgia. But in a perfect world, the ACC, but in reality, it's the Big Ten. I don't see Notre Dame aligning itself with the SEC. I don't think that they feel like they are an SEC fit academically. Now again, at some point, maybe all that is shot out of the water, and Notre Dame can't be high and mighty and hold themselves above, the SEC and the perception of the football factory, so to speak. But I think Big Ten is it. I think that's what Notre Dame will shoot for, especially, like when I think Notre Dame would like to keep their partners in terms of rivalries on the football field, and USC is the biggest one of those. And with USC joining the Big Ten, that allows them to negotiate something with the Big Ten where they can play USC every year like they do now, home and home.
In 2020, during the COVID pandemic, Notre Dame was a temporary member in football with the ACC. It seemed to work out well from the outside looking in. It was very strange seeing that ACC logo painted on the field, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was.
What were some of the lessons learned from Notre Dame in that temporary move, and how did that really go behind the scenes?
Yeah, I mean, the ACC saved Notre Dame's hide, and to a large extent, I've always given credit for Jack Swarbrick telling the ACC was going to follow the path of the Big Ten and Pac-12 and canceling their season. And it's always been my understanding that Jack Swarbrick told the people of the ACC, just hold tight and let a few more weeks of preseason go by. And as that happened, things loosened up a little bit more for COVID. So from that standpoint, he helped. It was good for both. I mean, it was because Notre Dame made more money in that 1 year in ACC than they've made. So that was certainly beneficial to them. But, I mean, I think as Notre Dame looks at and Notre Dame fans look at the ACC, they don't see the type of competition that they feel Notre Dame needs in order to, thrust itself up into the playoff contention. Now, Notre Dame went to the playoffs in 2018. They went to the playoffs in 2020. So it does work for them. There's no doubt about that. But, I think this is something that we've kicked around on our podcast, is that, the upper echelon of the ACC doesn't really match up to the upper echelon of the Big Ten. And if you look at the middle of the pack, it's really that way as well. So I think everything is right now is at least long term. Again, I want to emphasize long term, because I don't think the Notre Dame's in an immediate hurry to give up their independence. But I think long term, that's what points to the Big Ten for them.
I wanted to get into a competitive conversation here about Notre Dame, because you just mentioned it. with Jack Shorbrick. He's so heavily involved in the college football playoff and what it's going to look like in the future. And the proposal that they were discussing last year that looked like it was going to be approved, and then of course it didn't end up happening, and it's been kind of tabled, was that we would go to a 12-team playoff. But the thing that would be an issue potentially for Notre Dame was that Notre Dame as an independent would not be eligible to get a first round bye, even if Notre Dame was the clear cut number one team in the country, which Jack Schwarber kind of said, hey, listen, I was part of these conversations. We're okay with that. The cynic in me sits back and goes, you're okay with it now, but when it actually happens and the emotions get involved, that's when you go, man, we don't like this. Is that something going forward, one, when we just talk about the college football playoff, that needs to be discussed and maybe tweaked going forward that you've been hearing about? And then secondly, how does that maybe affect Notre Dame in the multitude of factors into whether to join a conference?
Well, I think, Jack Swarbrick was at the forefront of making the concession that they would not have that first round bye, recognizing that the argument against Notre Dame is you don't have a conference game to play, and so you're one game short, and you don't have to go through the gauntlet some other teams do. He recognized that. I think Jack Swarbrick has done a really good job of acknowledging that there are some advantages that Notre Dame has in that position, and so they had to give something back. So I think from that perspective, as long as he's the AD, I think that they can accept that factor. If that hasn't been voted in, so we don't know if ultimately that's what the format will be. But we're certainly, as the conferences grow larger, there's no doubt that we're going to an expanded playoff scenario. I think it's kind of ironic because we see, with a 4-team playoff, we see teams getting hammered, on a regular basis in the playoffs. So if you expand it to 8 and 12, that's certainly going to happen more frequently. But that's the direction that people want to go. There's more money to be made by playing more playoff games. I find it, I was going to say humorous, but I don't know that it's not humorous that these decisions seem to be made at the expense of an athlete. I'm joking that, okay, USC is now going to be in the same conference as Maryland. So you're going to fly across the country on a Wednesday night with no concern whatsoever for the student athlete as to what they have to go through. And I'm sure they will, they'll try to schedule things so that West Coast traveling to East Coast or vice versa is done on the weekend, but you can't do that in every instance. So, there's not a whole lot of concern about the student athlete as they move forward, but 12-team playoff, I think it probably goes to 12 from 4 as opposed to 8. I think 8 is fine. Even then, you're going to have some blowout losses, but it's all about making money and access and getting more teams in the mix. So that's where we're headed. That part's not going to change, especially as we talk about conference expansion.
Yeah, looks like it's going to 12 teams, and Mark Keenum, the board chairman there, told me last month that he thinks they're going to have a format in place and approved by next May of 2023. So we'll see what happens. I'm interested to hear what kind of tweaks they make to that proposal they were trying to settle on going forward. So, hey, I wanted to talk quickly about Notre Dame under Marcus Freeman. The recruiting is just off the charts. As we record this, Notre Dame is number 2 in the 24/7 Sports composite for the 2023 recruiting class. Notre Dame always going to be an amazing spot for recruiting, but right now they are just on an absolute tear.
Well, Marcus Freeman is a man possessed, and for those of us that cover the Brian Kelly era for 12 years, I mean, I don't want to be unfair to him, and I'm always the first one to say, Marcus Freeman should thank his lucky stars. He inherited a program from Brian Kelly. It's won 54 times, in the last 5 years. But recruiting is on the upswing. There's no doubt, and that's because he puts it at the forefront of every day of his life. And Brian Kelly didn't do that, for better or for worse. He still ended up winning 113 games, all-time leader in wins at Notre Dame with 113. So he had a lot of success. He played for 3 national titles in 12 years. or at least two of the playoff opportunities with the 4-team format. But Marcus Freeman's great at recruiting, and he addresses it every day, and he makes his assistant coaches address it every day, and it shows. Now, when all is said and done, there's a lot of 5-stars out there that are going to still commit to Alabama and Ohio State and Clemson and SEC teams. And as we look at it, Notre Dame's not in on that many more 5-star players, so they'll level out a little bit. They're not going to finish number one, but they're probably going to finish in the top 5. And that puts them in a really good spot. It takes them up to the next level. Is it better than 54 wins in 5 years? Well, that Marcus Freeman's going to have to prove that he's as good of a head coach on game day as Brian Kelly was. People always criticize Brian Kelly because all he did was win the games he should. That's what they would say. That's how you get into the playoffs, is you win the games that you should. He did that all the time. We don't know whether Marcus Freeman can do that or not, but by doing what he's doing recruiting wise, he's giving himself a pretty good chance to follow up with success after Brian Kelly.
Well, that's going to do it this episode of the College Football Daily. Tim, thank you so much for joining us. Make sure to check out Irish Illustrated. For our producer, Lance Glenn, I'm Brandon Marcello.